Okay, hi everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you may be. Welcome to the Ocean Supercluster Resilience Call for Proposal, Full Proposal Phase webinar that we're offering to all advanced applicants. So there's about 30 people on the line today, so not too big, not too small. And over the next couple hours or so, we're going to provide you with what we think is information that will be relevant to everybody, and talk through some of the key things that we just wanted to make you aware of in terms of how to approach the proposal, what we're looking for in terms of the submission and the application, and just talk through some of the key items that we're typically talking about at a full proposal phase, so that we can kind of preemptively answer some of those questions, and then obviously follow up with you in the weeks ahead as you continue to advance your proposals. So next slide, please. Great. Oh, if you could just go to the agenda again, Nicola. Yeah, back one. Perfect. So this is a bit of the layout for what we're going to go through. We very likely will not need the full 2 hours, but we did schedule that and are available if there's that many questions. But we don't think we will need that long. So we're going to kick the meeting off with a full proposal kind of process overview. We're going to walk through the proposal template, and then we're going to stop after that point for some Q&A based on that content. And then we're going to dive into the consortium models and membership, which are typically some of the trickier parts of in terms of the decision making at the full proposal stage, and have direct impacts on your budget. And so we want to really take some time and walk through some of those things. We're taking a bit of an approach where we're kind of preemptively assuming a couple of different project models based on the applications that we have, and trying to give some upfront advice on how to construct them. But they'll no doubt have some follow-up questions, which we can answer on a one-on-one basis after this session. Then we're going to take a bit of time to go through the financials and some of the key aspects around that, and then wrap the whole thing up with some Q&A and next steps. So I guess maybe before we dive in, the Q&A, you should be able to see that. There's a chat function available through Teams, the little speech bubble there. So feel free to pile your questions into that speech bubble. Please note that this is relatively anonymous. And so if you've got a really project-specific question, you're probably better off waiting to ask that outside of this webinar. But if you've got a question that you think is relevant to the content that we presented, and is something that you would want to have answered in front of quite a few people, then please feel free to pile those questions in there, and we'll as a group we'll tackle them when we get to that. But we'll be getting to them at kind of certain points in the webinar, and won't be just doing them on as soon as they show up. So with that, next slide, please. Great. So just a really quick kind of introduction to the Ocean Supercluster Resilience Program. And I know by now you guys are all familiar with the guidelines, and we've had a number of events, a launch webinar, as well as a project ideation session. And so, generally speaking, the Ocean Supercluster Resilience call for proposals is a new call for proposals that we've issued. It's a one-time only event, one-time only call. And we are looking for projects that will compellingly and convincingly demonstrate ocean digital transformation, will strengthen private-public sector connections, and build diverse partnerships between OSC members. We had a very successful, quite oversubscribed first round, so congratulations to all of you for making it through. Many provinces, sectors, and organizational types are participating in OSCR, and they are definitely shaping up to be some of the most interesting and distinctive and unique, I guess, in terms of the value proposition that they offer to the OSC portfolio, and really excited and encouraged by what we saw come in during the EOI round, and definitely looking forward to seeing the projects advance and mature through the full proposal process. Next slide. Great. So this is just a kind of nuts and bolts. I won't spend too much time on this slide, but all successful EOI applicants have been informed about this and have received an invitation to submit a full proposal. All unsuccessful applicants have also been notified, in case you were wondering about that. All applicants are required to prepare and submit proposals in line with the prescribed format that we've issued. And please see the application, the call for proposals guidelines, as well as, in particular, the full proposal template for additional instructions around that. All the instructions associated with the full proposal process are not in this deck. This is a bit more of an overview about how to tackle some of the working level aspects of it. The proposal deadline is on the 14th at 4 p.m. Atlantic time, and completed proposals need to be submitted to the OSCR email address. That's all. This is listed on your proposal template as well. Every applicant has also received key feedback points and has also been scheduled to have a meeting with ourselves where we're going to be going over the feedback. That's all been provided in a fair, kind of consistent format in terms of the level of detail, and is essentially, the key pieces of information that came out from the evaluation process during the EOI reviews that evaluators were keen on having applicants ensure they understood and received, so that they could hopefully work and think a bit more about that as they were developing their full proposals. And as a bit also as an FYI, if there are additional connections or additional partners or other members that you would like to potentially get identified, particularly in the OSC member network, we'll be asking you this question during your full meet next week as part of kind of the support that we're providing to all applicants. Again, we're doing it in a relatively consistent way. If there's a particular type of member that you're looking for to get connected to or to kind of solicit involvement in your project, please let us know kind of what the characteristics of that potential member or members are, and we'll do our best to have a look at the OSC network, which is pretty expansive now. It's approximately 400 organizations, and see if we can't make an introduction for you. Next slide, please. Okay, so key OSC contacts. So when in doubt, just send your questions to OSCR and we will get them distributed to the right person. But if you have a specific question related to membership, then please send that to membership@oceansupercluster.ca. And again, if you send it into OSCR, we'll get to it and then forward it on to there. But you might skip you could potentially skip a bit of a delay if you go direct in some of these instances with really specific questions around membership, or also around budgets and cost eligibility. So Kim, a green slate is available to answer questions, and anything related specifically to IP and the IP rationale, feel free to reach out to Andy Stone, who is our IP manager. But again, if you've got any question and you're unsure of who to send it to, you can always start with OSCR, and we'll make sure that finds the right path. We will likely respond to your question within 24 hours, but we will definitely respond to it within 48 hours. So that's the time frame in which we were able to process requests. Next one. Perfect. So I'm going to stop with the deck here now. This deck is going to be available to everybody, as well as a recording of this video. So if you miss anything, or if you need to pop out for a meeting, or you just couldn't get to this today, or you want to understand where the guidance material is, you can access this deck. It will be available, and the video recording will be as well. The link to the consolidated guidance material is right here on this slide. And so what that is it's basically a 1 to 2 page document that has got an outline of all the guidance material that we have available about the Technology Leadership Program. And there's links to a number of other documents that kind of do a bit more of a deep dive into some of the various aspects. So there's a cost eligibility set of guidelines, for example. So, if for example, if you don't get all your questions answered today around financial aspects and you really want to understand something in a bit more detail, this is kind of your one-stop link to getting to any information that we have publicly available about the program, and comes in a variety of different forms. So this is a bit of a roll-up of all of that, with some kind of directive guidance around where to go to get information. You can always ask questions, but quite often you can get to the answers to your questions by just clicking on this link and going to the guidance available for that particular topic. And with that, now I'm going to take a few minutes and walk through the proposal template. So Nicole, I'm going to share my screen, right? Yeah, share. And here we go. Okay, so you should be able to see my this Word document that I have here now. And someone let me know somehow if you can't. Probably the chat function. Okay, hang on now. I just need to get the zoom up a bit here. Okay, so I won't spend too much time on the proposal template, but I did want to take a burn down through this and make sure you understood some key things in relation to it. It's a special template we developed just for this program. And you'll notice right off the bat that the template has been developed directly in line with the key selection criteria that are present and elaborated in the proposal, the call for proposals guidelines. And so you should understand by the format of this template, the nature of the questions that are being asked in relation to each of the key criteria for the program, which constitute industrial relevancy and growth, innovativeness of the project idea, quality of collaboration, and reach of the impact, and project execution plan and KPIs. And I'm realizing you guys might not be able to see this here, so hang on. Okay. Yeah, so I guess the first comment here is to make sure you please take a look down through the instructions. There's some pretty important information in here. And if you end up, in non-compliance with some of these aspects, it could potentially put you at risk for disqualification, in particular the deadline, right? Do not submit your proposal late. 1 minute late is a serious problem, and you will be disqualified if you submit the proposal late. So don't take chances on it getting caught in kind of server ether land and have it come into our server too late. So please don't wait until the last minute to submit your proposal. It's a serious problem. And there's some other, I guess, items in here that I won't go through in too much detail, but I guess maybe one of the key things is that we've allocated a very generous word count to this particular call, significantly more than any other call that we have. And that's around the basis that we want to be sure that people have the ability to be able to provide the detail that we're looking for on this particular proposal. And you'll also notice that it doesn't include graphics or letters of support. So it's a pretty generous word count. Please don't abuse that, though. Generally redundancy and kind of repeats of the same concepts over and over again don't get well received by reviewers. So, despite the generous word count allocation, please use it smartly. And don't feel in any way that you need to kind of get your word count up just to get the word count up. That is not kind of the basis for the proposal approval is not going to be on how many words you have in your proposal. But you should not have an issue with the allocation that we've provided. This is relatively straightforward here. Maybe just a quick flag on the proposal title. We're looking for a title that is not really, extraordinarily long. We run into issues with that down the line once the project's approved and we're doing press announcements and that type of thing. So please come up with a relatively simple project title that hopefully describes, what your project's about, but does so in 10 words or less. Ideally, 7 to 8 words would be ideal. In terms of section 2.3 there, and we're going to get into this later in the webinar, but I think it's important here to make sure that you list all of your industry contributions, regardless of whether or not that industry player is acting as a subcontractor or acting as a primary participant and actually executing and signing the agreement. And so, regardless of the level of contribution and regardless of the role that they are playing in the project, please feel free to use this table in the full proposal template to list your contributions that are coming in. The detailed budget will kind of help delineate all that, but this is the spot where the reviewers will see who wants to make a commitment to the project, and it's not as material in this particular section to be calling them out as a subcontractor or not. That gets sorted out kind of in more detail in the financial template, but it is important to characterize and identify the industry contributions that are coming into your project, even if they're small. So please, use this table liberally to add those individuals in, because as you'll see later in the webinar, subcontractors will actually get rolled up right in the budget, and this is a good place to bring some visibility to the contributions that those companies are making. Maybe just a bit of flag on section 2.3 around the project duration. So costs that are incurred beyond March 31st, 2023 will be subject to the OSC initiative and the Innovation Superclusters initiative in general. being renewed or extended. We're obviously not doing that without some level of confidence that that's going to happen. But at this point in time, that has not been determined with 100% certainty, and so we are risk sharing that with you guys, and are accepting projects that run longer and run past that date. But we do want to flag that that there's a risk associated to those costs, and there'll be we'll need to develop kind of a natural termination point around that time frame, so that if the eventuality occurred that we weren't able to support the project beyond that date, that we had a formal way to wrap the project up. So again, we're not doing that without some amount of risk, and we wouldn't be doing that without some level of certainty in it, but we're not 100% sure about that yet. On section 3 there, just a quick, it's been highlighted, but please note that section 3.1 is essentially what the minister, for example, would use in preparing their notes on the project announcement. And so it's a relatively critical piece of content that will end up getting used by our communication VP, will be used by ISED potentially if the project's approved. So take the time to kind of really wrap up that first 400 words in a way that's really compelling, and obviously not sharing information about the project that you don't want to have shared. So just a bit of a flag that section 3.1 there gets used over and over again by government agents as part of a way to describe the project if it was approved and is publicly announced. The rest of the proposal is confidential, and information will not be taken from the rest of the proposal for that purpose. Okay. And so in section 4 there, and I won't take too much time, basically what's happening is we're kind of having the questions guide you down from a high level of detail around the overarching ocean challenge that the project is focused on, through to the relevance to industry from a global and regional perspective, down to the specific project outcomes and products and platforms and capabilities that will be developed by the project, through to anticipated benefits for industry, as well as a reference in section 4.5 there to the individual letters of support from industry. And so you'll see that section 4 is all about kind of overarching industry challenge that the project is associated with, and what the benefits are to industry. And you'll see in section 4.4 there that we're asking folks to elaborate on this in much more detail than what was possible in the EOI, just because of the nature of the template. We'd like you, if possible, to present these benefits in terms of discrete use cases and target user groups or commercial applications. And generally, we have two types of projects that have advanced the full proposal. We have projects that have a relative to the biggest projects, a relatively small number of collaborators and a relatively narrow focus in terms of commercial applications that will be delivered from it, and the private public sector partnerships that will be delivered from them, and they're relatively clear. And then we also have kind of these bigger, broader, much more significant project consortiums that have, at least at this stage, at the EOI stage, a little bit less clarity around their commercial applications. And so in this full proposal stage, we really like, particularly the applicants that have these larger consortiums and these bigger projects, to discretize the value of the platform, for example, or the ultimate solution into more specific use cases, right, with specific benefits for each application, and not take the time to or from a vision perspective really convey what you're trying to do, but get below that level of detail and talk about specific user groups and applications that will benefit from the solution and what that actually means. And then I guess to help everybody with this, we've adopted a bit of an approach here where we are encouraging folks to put in individual letters of support. And so, for example, if you're a company or an organization that's listening and are part of a bigger consortium, and you have a specific benefit and a specific interest in the overarching project that you're participating in, please take the time to write that down, because it's really important. And it gives a lot of specificity and a lot of a lot of value to kind of supporting the overarching vision that no doubt will be put forward by the key people involved in putting the whole proposal together and communicating that vision on behalf of everybody. And so the detail that's provided in the letters of support, that's really a great spot to kind of lay down specifically what the project means to you as an organization or as a company or as a public sector partner, and what you're going to get out of it, and specifically what role you have in the project, if in fact that is the case. And so in this particular case, you don't really even need to put anything down for section 4.5. Some projects might choose to maybe not do as many letters of support and put in specific paragraphs, what each individual firm would bring to the table, organization would bring to the table and get out of it. You could take that approach, but in cases where it makes good sense, particularly if you've got lots of players and there's lots of diversity in terms of the benefits that are resulting from the project and how people are getting involved, then please, use our letter of support template to do that. And we'll go through. Actually, we're going to go through that later in this webinar. The innovativeness of the project idea is the next section. I think we've broken this out from both a technological perspective as well as a non-technological perspective, because some of the primary benefits and some of the real innovation in some of these projects is in some cases not necessarily technological, and that's fine for this call. So we've kind of broken that out so that can be a bit more clear. And then in the quality of collaboration and reach of impact section, it's a bit of a repeat, I guess, from the industry relevant section in terms of the approach. So we're really trying to understand the public-private sector partnership piece. Why is that meaningful and distinctive? Also encouraging folks to use letter of support in cases where that's appropriate, in line with my previous comments in the other section there. And lay down, the significance of the initiative and the legacy that were left behind by the project. And you'll see it's all still wrapped up in our overarching criteria weighting and making sure that we're still getting approximately equal kind of representation of the project merits across all the criteria here. And then the last section is relatively self-explanatory, with possibly the exception of section 7.1 there. So to the extent that it's helpful, and it may be in the conveyance of your idea and your details, feel free to use kind of a role definition. We just put a little table in here to try to help with this, to lay out, who the key roles are in your project and who's involved, because in some cases there's quite a few organizations involved, and this kind of clarity, both for yourselves as well as the evaluators, could bring quite a bit of value to the proposal in terms of it just being possible to be well understood. So that's kind of the basis for that. In section 7.2 there, we're looking for key principles around project governance. You don't need to lay down a complete project steering committee and voting rights and blah blah blah, but it is kind of encouraging folks to think a little bit harder about this at the full proposal stage, and make the link to what we're going to be talking about later in this webinar in terms of who's signing the contract, who's not signing the contract, who's a material collaborator, who's on this project steering committee, and why, right? And so this section 7.2 here, just make the link between the principles that we're talking about later in this webinar today in the deck, and this particular section. It'll probably be helpful to you. And then I think I'll probably, that's the gist of it. I think the rest of it is relatively straightforward. And obviously just noting that a project budget template is required, and that's a separate Excel document that you also have received that needs to be completed and submitted. And a project budget, detailed project budget, is required for a complete application. So please, please don't not submit that. The IP rationale here is a bit of a custom for this call. The first number of questions there are trying to kind of get at the nature of the assets, intellectual property, and in particular data assets. We have quite a few data intensive projects coming into the call in terms of who owns them, what is required to execute the project, who needs them during the project, how are you going to disseminate the outcomes of the project. All those things are quite important to OSCR projects, as it turns out, and so we've kind of developed this section to try to more appropriately draw out those things, so that you can get them written down and understand the nature of what you're developing and who owns them and how you're going to proliferate that after you're done. And so in some cases, the IP may not be that substantial, but if that's the case, there's probably still quite a bit that you can add in terms of what the project means for future IP assets and future commercialization opportunities, for example, and generally how the project is supporting commercialization of Canadian technology and proliferation of Canadian technology. So it's again, if there's any questions around this, please reach out to our IP manager or just generally, and we'll get you sorted out on that on an individual project basis. So that's the gist of the project template. I'm gonna unshare this now, and we'll come back to the main deck. Nicole, would you? Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So next slide, please. Actually, I'm seeing here we've got Q&A, so let's just take a break and see if there's anything coming in on the Q&A yet. KPI examples. Yeah, that's a good one. So I guess there's indirect KPIs, and let me just go back to the proposal template, for example. There's indirect KPIs, and then there's direct KPIs. And so obviously, above all else, we would be looking for KPIs that would generate kind of a direct economic impact on Canada. But there's, I mean, other financial KPIs in terms of the return on OSC investment will be important. But I think in this particular call, it will also be important to draw out indirect KPIs. They might have, and what I mean by that is ones that may not be able to be realized in the time frame of the project execution. And so in this particular call, I think those are important too. But generally speaking, in terms of your key project outcomes, right? And so the proposal template asks you to lay out your key proposal outcomes and what you're going to deliver from an innovation standpoint, from a technological standpoint, or from a non-technological standpoint. So what we would be looking for is your performance indicators on primarily those project outcomes, right, in line with kind of the definition of a KPI. So I mean, we're happy to talk a bit more about that specifically with you, but that, I guess, that without kind of talking about a project example, that would be the primary guidance around that. Is they would need to be directly in line with your project outcomes and would need to be measurable. And you can include direct KPIs that would be able to be realized within the time frame of the project, right? As well as potentially some of the more indirect, less tangible ones. That's okay, but obviously the merit associated with those would obviously be a bit less. All right, so we'll come back to the deck here now. Next slide, please, Nicola. Yeah, so we're going to move on now to probably the beefiest part of this webinar in terms of complicated content, and likely where we'll get the most questions. And it is actually the first time that we've really kind of dug into explaining some of these at the proposal stage, when you're still, to a certain extent, really starting to figure this out just in the first instance. But felt it was important, particularly given how big some of these projects are, that we took some time to walk through some of the different scenarios in terms of how a project model can be constructed. And so the next part of the session is just going to be around how you would build up a consortium model, the different types of primary roles of a consortium member within a project, and how they affect the project budget, your contributions, the membership arrangement and type that you would have, as well as how they might affect your contribution to the project proposal process in terms of a letter of support, right? And so these generally project consortium models, we have a really high degree of flexibility at OSC, and the good news about being flexible is that we're flexible, and there's lots of different ways that you can govern a project and still have it be a viable OSC project. It is a collaborative model, and so there's actually a huge amount of flexibility in how you can build a project consortium. The downside of that is it can get complicated because there's lots of choices. And so your choice of project model is going to be driven ultimately by a number of different factors that you'll need to consider, but would certainly include the number of investors that you have, right? Do you have a few? Do you have a lot? How much are they investing? The nature of what they're investing in kind, cash, directly related to the project plan or not. number of contract parties. So how many parties do you actually want agreeing to all the terms and conditions, sharing in the project deliverables, participating in steering committee meetings, and all those kind of working level aspects of being a signing party. You know, how many of them do you want in your consortium as that kind of that primary group of project participants? It has an effect on overhead and costs and reimbursement, so we'll get into that. It has an effect on who needs to be on your project steering committee and how you'd ultimately govern your project, and the control that you certainly have a great deal of control once you're in execution with OSC projects. And so, you know, who governs that and who's on that committee. Those are really important details to think about up front, as well as just the, you know, who's executing the project on a task level, right, and actually involved in the execution of the project itself. And then who's actually benefiting from the project and the outcomes that are being delivered by the project. So all of these things play, you know, some part of the role in your choice of your project model that you use, as well as the position of a given organization within the model, right? So hopefully that wasn't too complicated, but that's kind of what we're going to be getting into in the next number of slides. And we'll be walking through a couple of different examples of how you can construct a model. But they're general, right? Obviously, this is a webinar, and there's quite a few people on, and so it's not gonna dictate how you choose your model, and it's probably not going to answer every question that you have about it. But it should give you a good idea of the type of model or models that would likely be most appropriate for your project, and give you a bit of a, I guess, a working lead on what types of additional follow-up questions you might want to ask us in the weeks ahead as you start to really dial in on who's playing what role and who's investing what, and what that means in terms of the governance and everything else. Next slide. Okay, and I can't remember if it's me doing this one. Maybe I'll do this slide, and then I'll hand it over to Corey, and I'll help and tag team with him on that as well. So there's for the purposes of the next few slides, we wanted to take a minute and make sure we're kind of defining at this point, before we get into a big discussion on project models, kind of two primary differentiators in terms of your role on a project, okay? And so the first one is a project participant. Okay, and so a project participant is a party that is actually signing the project agreement. So that's got all the terms and conditions in there, all of the, you know, the scope, the financial arrangements, the IP and data strategy, you know, all the annexes. Those are the individuals that are signing that agreement and need to obviously comply with all the terms and conditions of that agreement. They participate in the project steering committee, so they are the decision-making group on the project, and the makeup of those steering committees can vary, but you would be on that committee if you sign that agreement. And they can also be reimbursed for eligible costs by the OSC directly, right? And so if you're intending to be reimbursed by OSC for costs, whether they're your own or someone else's, you need to sign the project agreement. So it could be an industry member, right? It could be a private sector organization that is getting reimbursed for costs, or it could be a non-industry organization. It could be another material stakeholder that signs the agreement. Okay, eligible costs submitted to the project participants cannot contain overhead. So this is an important differentiator between project participants and project collaborators. It's a key tenet of the Innovation Supercluster Initiative program right across the country. The whole nature of the collaborative arrangement for the project is such that if you're signing the project agreement and you're getting reimbursed on costs, they can't contain overhead. The initiative does not fund overhead. There's, you know, a certain amount of allocation that can go towards CPP and EI, but generally speaking, that is a very big consideration often that organizations need to decide on in terms of whether they're signing the project agreement or not, or actually acting as a subcontractor. I guess in kind of offsetting all of that, these project participants are those that actually contribute to the primary basis for approval of the project, right? The collaborators that are signing the agreement, the ones that are driving the project and leading the project. And they're also very likely the ones directly and most substantially involved in benefiting from and having control over the project execution. So those are really important type of role in a project, and I wanted to make sure we could define that really clearly before we got into the types of roles that types of models that we can have. Because basically the types of models are just variations on the types of numbers of participants and project collaborators and how that would all work. The project collaborators, contrary, do not sign the project agreement. They may sit on the project steering committee if you so choose. That would be at the discretion of the project team. So sometimes they do sit on the committee, but not by default. And they also invoice or provide funds directly to the project participants, right? So that could be financial contributions. They could be key suppliers and subcontractors. They're basically kind of come underneath a project participant, and costs submitted by them may contain overhead. So they're in a, often in a subcontractor role, for example. They contribute to the basis for approval, but the involvement typically is less direct. Typically, it's not as significant of a contribution to the project. It's still meaningful generally for the people involved from their perspective, but generally not contributing to the primary basis for approval as much as the participants do, obviously. So that's the breakdown of the role, kind of primary role definition. So we'll move on to the next slide here. Oh, I think we missed one. And so I won't spend too much on this. I think I covered this already, but these are some of the questions that you would ask yourself to decide on whether or not you're a participant if it's not obvious. This might be very obvious to a party or to a project team in terms of how this all needs to get broken out, but if it's not, we would encourage you to read through these questions and help that, kind of drive your decision on these things. So if you're a participant, you're typically wanting to play a leadership role, validation of the technology, innovator role in the project. So you're doing some technology development work, for example. You're investing your own resources. Typically would want, in some cases, preferred access to the deliverables and the most, substantial benefits being generated by the project. And in some cases, as folks will understand through their feedback, in a lot of cases, there's sometimes a need to actually include certain types of parties as a material stakeholder in a project, just to help strengthen the project. And so, in some cases, it's probably helpful for you to have be a participant, because it would actually strengthen the entire proposal. That does happen. If you're a collaborator, you're typically wanting to provide a product or service to the project, and that's sort of it. You may want to, you're dedicated to the project and are supportive of the project. You want to see it go. You want to show your support, and that's important, particularly in OSCR. And so, you may not be intimately involved in the project execution, but you want to see the project go, and you want to be part of it being approved and being successful. So, still very important role. And will you benefit, right, from the outcomes versus possibly directly, involved in generating the outcomes? That's indicative of a collaborator. Next slide. And maybe just to wrap up this section, so this is a bit of an outline of the project steering committee composition. So just a couple of key points here. Participants, right, the signatories need to be on the steering committee. So they're obviously, the ones that are privy to the progress of the project, the approval of deliverables, change management, all that good stuff is kind of associated with being on the project steering committee. Although you may not be the project manager itself, but you'll be on the committee that's directing the project manager. And as I indicated earlier, material stakeholders may also be on the steering committee. That can often be in the form of an advisor or an observer. There's a significant amount of flexibility on the voting rights in OSC projects. Lots of times people do that kind of somewhat in line or directly in line based on financial contributions, but it can be based on other rationale as well. Next slide. Okay, so one last note here just around letter of support. So as part of the documentation for the project, we would definitely encourage non-signing collaborators, particularly ones that have kind of a detail and support to provide that's quite specific to their own organization, and they want to contribute to that. Please, it would be helpful even at this stage to provide a letter of support, because we will ultimately need that. If you have a specific role in the project plan, and or discrete set of benefits in the project. And so basically, you know, if you're involved in a project, and this does happen all the time, even if it's not an investing type of role, is important, and we will be seeking to document that involvement and that benefit that you would derive from the project through a letter of support, because it helps us maintain the original basis for approval, because how you're involved in it actually really matters. And so that's the why behind the letter of support. And in some cases, you know, particularly with really material subcontractors, for example, where they have a specialized set of capability to bring into the project that is not easily replaceable. That's just one example. We would be looking, you know, for a letter of support to confirm that your awareness and your understanding of your involvement in the project plan and the benefits that you would derive from that. And so we have provided, just as try to be helpful, a letter of support template that you have all received, and it's got quite a bit of detail just around the types of things that would be indicative of a really strong support letter. In some cases, that might not be possible or might not even be appropriate, depending on your level of involvement. But and that will be up to yourselves to kind of figure out in terms of the right amount of detail and the right kind of nature of the letter to come in. But we've tried to be as specific as we can and help make it clear to everybody the type of letter and the content that will be in that letter that really adds to the strength of the project application. They do get reviewed, they are important, and reviewers can very readily kind of suss through a letter and understand whether or not that's just kind of a generic letter that an organization is sending to kind of any old thing, or something really specific that highlights and characterizes the nature of what you're getting from the project and why you're interested in it, and some of those details that come through with a bit more effort, right, and articulation. So we've tried to make that a bit more clear, and not to say that, you know, just a generic letter of support may not necessarily be helpful, but typically, you know, more specificity and more detail in those letters that really draw out the why behind your letter of support can be quite helpful to the overall application. And we have structured the application so that these things do matter, and is quite often the best spot potentially for your specific kind of case to reside if you've got a big project with a whole pile of members coming on. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to hand it over. Go back. I'm going to hand it over to Corey now, and he's going to run you through the next few here.
Hi, Susan. Corey actually just lost power. He let me know. So he's going to try to join on his cell phone. If you want to go ahead and
keep going. That's fine.
Okay.
I guess I'll just keep going here. And so Corey is our membership lead, and is obviously a little bit technically challenged at the moment. Hopefully I don't lose power, then we'll be in real trouble. But I guess just to summarize industry membership, so if you are a private sector firm that is looking to get reimbursement on funds that you would contribute, you will need to become an industry member. It is what enables OSC to match funds. You do not need to become an industry member now. You can become an industry member later, once we've completely dialed in your detailed budget and your contributions down to a specific dollar level. So we kind of try to avoid people signing up as members and having to you know, redo that to a certain extent later. And so, but you will need to be aware of the fact that if you're making a contribution and you're looking to get reimbursement and you're looking for OSC match, that you will need to become an industry member once the project is approved. And so just a couple of key points: private sector organizations looking for matching funds need to sign the project agreement and become an industry member and be on the project steering committee. So there's a really significant role that investing private sector organizations that are looking to match funds have in the project. So this is kind of reiterating on some of those fundamentals that I introduced earlier. Your organization either needs to be a for-profit or a not-for-profit that receives its funds primarily from the private sector to qualify to become an industry member. And so in cases where there's some question around that, we'll be following up with individual organizations to make sure that they're actually eligible to be an industry member. So that'll be happening in the next few weeks. Industry members commit funds to OSC in addition to what's invested in their project. And so that in line with our UMA and our overall membership model for the initiative is equivalent to 15% of your cash contribution. And what that means is it actually results, just to be really clear, the net of all that, the kind of transactional details put aside, is that you receive a 42.5% reimbursement on $1, right? And so, oh, I see Corey there joining on his phone. But I'm just cluing up the slide on industry membership here, Corey. I can keep going if you're technically challenged. So just let me know.
It seems to be okay. So that was terrible timing because I was just getting prepped and it just cut out all of a sudden. So I'm happy to jump in whenever is appropriate. Okay,
well this is perfect. I was just I just burned out through this and covered most of the basic points. I don't know if there's anything in addition. I didn't go through the last bullet, so maybe if that's okay. I kind of went through the basics about why you need to be an industry member and what that translates to in terms of the membership contribution and the fee, but that's kind of where I ended up.
Okay, sounds good. Well, we can go into the scenarios here and I can provide some color to it and a little bit more context and structure. Okay, so what we're going to run through the next couple of slides here is 3 different scenarios. And what it does is it places the different roles we discussed in the context of a project in terms of project participants and collaborators.
I have a feeling his power is gone.
The OSC to, is it cutting in and out?
Yeah, if it keeps happening, we'll have to do something, but let's give it another go.
Okay.
Yeah, he might be SOL, I think, by the way this is going here. Or we all might be. Okay, I'll try to pick this up and take it through. I don't know if we're going to be able to get Corey on here today. So this is the first scenario, which we've kind of tagged the standard scenario, I guess probably because it's the least complicated of the 3 and probably most in line with how one would think you typically sign a project agreement, outside of kind of major exceptions. And so here we have a situation kind of representative of what we discussed on the previous slides, where the industry member, right, the private sector firm that is seeking the reimbursement on the cash contributions that they are making, right, to the project, they sign the project agreement. You do have scenarios in some cases where you have a material stakeholder that may also need to sign the project agreement. They are, that doesn't happen all the time, but material stakeholders may not be making a contribution at all. They could be using industry member contributions, or they might be really integral to the execution and the success of the project and need to be part of the steering committee and need to be, generating the deliverables and really heavily involved, but they're not actually making a cash contribution to the project. And so we've kind of called them material stakeholders or collaborators. And so that's one example of a project model. It's probably the most likely and most kind of numerous one that we have. But it's probably a simple one where you don't actually have a lot of subcontractors, and the primary people involved in the project are those that are executing the agreement. They're also doing the work. If contributors are seeking over $50,000 in matching funds, this is very likely what your project structure will look like. If you are seeking less than $50,000, if your contribution is less than $50,000, then we would probably recommend you kind of come in as underneath another industry member to simplify the contracting process and also to reduce your actual membership innovation ecosystem fee, because there's a impact of being a low level contributor on that front. And so, but in the case where you've got a couple of industry members all contributing a significant amount of dollars, and all representing the project team and the execution of the work, this is what your model would look like. Okay. Next one. Great. Okay. So scenario 2 is what we'll call a bit of a consolidation. So kind of moving up in the complexity here now. And definitely recall kind of the key points that we made earlier around the difference between a project participant from a steering committee standpoint, from an overhead standpoint, from a participation in the project plan standpoint. And so you need to go back probably and take a look at what is a project participant, what does that mean, what are the impacts of being that kind of role versus what are the impacts of being a collaborator role, and the impact that that has on the strength of your application, I guess, underlining all of that. And you're going to need to decide kind of what the right arrangement is for you, and definitely consider all those different things. But this is a view of a second scenario where you've got the organizations that are supporting the project as contributors, right, or subcontractors. They're really collaborators here, right, but they don't actually sign the project agreement. And there's a lot of benefit to not having a huge number of parties sign the project agreement, right? You may not want to have 20 people looking at every T&C and having all their legal departments looking at all that. You will likely be doing that in perpetuity. And so, getting the project participant number down to who actually needs to sign the agreement, and generally not including people that don't need to sign the project agreement, is typically the quickest way to get to done on a contract, as many of you know. And so those are kind of hard decisions that you need to make around who needs to sign the project agreement, who needs to put in their funds versus who doesn't. And so subcontractors can invoice industry members at fair market value, and then their costs can be submitted by the industry member through to the OSC for reimbursement. Okay, and so you can have variations on this. You can have hub and spoke, for example, where you've got the one member kind of acting as the main cash flow mechanism and project management mechanism for the project. So you do have some members that want to play that role. You have some projects where that's not as obvious of a role, or obvious who is going to be playing that role. So that's a situation where you probably have more industry members going directly, seeking that reimbursement directly from OSC. For organizations contributing less than $50,000 cash or in kind, and we still welcome organizations contributing those amounts, and you should still take the time to list them on the proposal template and talk a bit, in your letter of support, if that's in fact how you choose to talk about it, about the nature of why you're contributing. They do matter. They're actually, for how small they are, sometimes they can be significant, especially if you've got a number of them. But from a project model standpoint, and from a just contractual, strategy standpoint, you're better off consolidating those contributions under an industry member. That's the best way to do it. You cannot do that. You can do something a bit different and have more people sign the agreement, but there's trade-offs to doing that. And so in cases where you have a relatively small cash contribution or just in kind only, you're better off having this type of model. If you have multiple partners making smaller contributions, you can contract with them directly and then consolidate them. So that's a bit of an overview of that particular model. And none of these are kind of cookie cutter for your particular project, I should say. We're just trying to give you some idea of the flexibility that you have with how you structure these things. Corey, are you back on here now?
I am back on. Seems fickle, but it's good for the moment.
Okay, want to pick up scenario 3? Just because I've been talking for an hour here. I'm going to just get a drink. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, that sounds good. So this is our third option here, and I'd say this is the most unique one, where we kind of focus on a project participant who is not necessarily a private sector organization. So this model here is focused on, say, an organization who's a nonprofit who receives their funds from the private sector, who's leading a project and wants to take a leadership role in executing the project. They need to work with their industry partners, the private sector organizations, to unlock the matching funds from the OSC. That means the organizations they're working with need to, those who are going to be making the investment need to sign the project agreement and become industry members. And then they're able to provide those funds to the material stakeholder so that they can execute the project and submit costs to the OSC and be reimbursed by the OSC. And what's key here is they need to follow the guidelines of eligible cost submissions. And that means there wouldn't be any overhead on the costs that they're submitting. So that's to say, through this model, we're able to enable nonprofit organizations who receive their funds from the public to participate in projects and execute projects and submit costs to the OSC by leveraging the funds that are invested by other private sector industry members. And this is a little bit more unique to the model of OSCR. There's a couple instances like this. So we can certainly talk through how these funds would flow, but this is what it essentially enables, is that organization to participate directly and submit costs to the OSC. And this is, of course, kind of can be layered along with scenario 2 if any of these industry members had, subcontractors or financial contributors. There can be that element too. These industry members are also able to execute on the project and submit claims to the OSC. It's just one example. And that's kind of the third scenario here of our kind of archetypes, if you will. But again, they can be mix and match a little bit, and we're happy to have those conversations about what works best for your consortium. Okay, good for the next slide. That might round out the section there. I'm not sure if you want to do a little Q&A on that part.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good idea. Let me just see here. What do we got? 5, okay, so we got a couple here. Oh, what do you mean? So there's some stuff here from previous. So what do you mean by underlying economic drivers? So that's really kind of the nature of, I guess it probably can mean more than one thing, which is why we don't articulate and get really specific about it. But it's really around the nature of the industry or the sector or the the economic basis, right, for the project. There's typically some really significant drivers that exist in the Canadian ocean economy around the nature of the industry challenge and the challenge in general, right, that you're trying to solve. And so, it's kind of the underlying economic basis that kind of helps you characterize what the actual challenge is that's in your project and what you're going to address and what your outcomes ultimately are. Okay. Define material stakeholder. Well, material stakeholder in this case, we've got the slide right up here, is someone that's material, like they're involved in the project in a way that's significant to the degree that it makes sense for them from a couple of different perspectives, maybe from a governance perspective or an execution perspective or a decision-making perspective, something significant in terms of them needing to sign that agreement and agree to all the terms and conditions, and needing to understand and support the delivery of the project and the associated deliverables, access to the information about the project and the internal dealings of the project, like that. It's somebody who, in one way or another deserves to sign that project agreement for something significant. And so, what we're trying to avoid here is people getting the impression that you need to sign the project agreement just for the sake of it. You typically don't want to have a huge number of project participants. And so if they're signing the project agreement, there would need to be a clear reason, right? And that reason would kind of show the materiality of that particular stakeholder needing to sign. I know that wasn't that specific, but that's effectively what it means. We're trying to help people sort out what that means there. That's all the questions we have, Corey. So we could probably keep going there. Next up, we've got the finance team that's going to do a bit of a run through on the budget stuff.
Thanks, Susan. Good afternoon, everyone. The finance team here at the OSC will work with you to understand the project budget. And in doing that, we're going to provide some additional clarity on the following items. So in-kind contributions versus cash. Eligible product costs can include in-kind contributions. In-kind contributions to projects are defined as cash equivalent goods or services that replace an incremental expense that would have to have been purchased by the member. In-kind contributions must be relevant and central to the activities and objectives of the project and must be eligible project costs as per the cost eligibility guidelines. Some examples of in-kind contributions could be the use of ship time, could be materials and supplies that are incremental to the project that would have otherwise had to be purchased. It could be workspace that is incremental to the project that you would otherwise have to have rented. Important thing to note here is that all wages, salaries, and non-discretionary benefits incurred by each project participant is considered cash and cannot be provided as an in-kind contribution. In-kind contributions must be valued at fair market value. If a member is seeking a match for the in-kind contribution, us at the OSC Finance will follow up with each project participant for supporting documentation to determine how the goods and services are valued. So it's really important to make sure that your in-kind contributions follow that they're at fair market value and have the documentation. For members that are not seeking a match on their in-kind contribution, reasonable steps must be taken to ensure that a price that would have otherwise had to be paid in a non-arm's length transaction. In this situation, a member must find a fair market value form to show the value of the in-kind contribution. Foreign costs. On an exceptional basis, the OSC will authorize expenditures occurred outside of Canada as funded eligible project costs that are eligible for OSC matching. If it's in the opinion of the OSC that these expenditures are necessary for the success of the project and could not otherwise be undertaken here in Canada. So to obtain approval for the foreign costs, the lead participant must show that Canadian-based options have been evaluated with the conclusion that no parties with the abilities to deliver the required product or service to support the project were found. The lead participant would then sign a form to show that these costs were necessary for the success of the project. It's important to note too that not all foreign expenditures related to the project will require approval. For example, travel to another country in the pursuit of networking opportunities would be okay. Travel and costs associated to attending conferences outside of Canada or training outside of Canada would be okay. Equipment, materials, or supplies that are procured from suppliers outside of Canada and shipped to Canada, they would be okay. Another thing we'll help you look at is significant capital expenditures. Eligible product costs can include capital expenditures. Capital expenditures must be linked to the objective of the project. They must be vital for the success of research, development, demonstration, or commercialization of the project, and they must otherwise not be a shared resource. So for capital expenditures in excess of $1 million, pre-approval is required by the OSC. Pre-approval is also required for purchase of integrated assets that depend on one another to function in excess of $1 million. We will also look at the subcontractors. Subcontractor costs are eligible, provided they cover costs for work that is essential to the project and where the expertise does not exist among the partners. Costs must be at fair market value and in line with industry norms. A project partner, as Susan mentioned, a project partner or employee of a project partner cannot be a subcontractor. And it's important to confirm that all signatories to the contracted are not included as subcontractors in the submitted budget, as Susan talked about earlier. When submitting eligible costs, you will be submitting your direct wages and mandatory benefits. All salaries and labor costs must have timesheets and payroll costs to support these costs. Wages must include only non-discretionary benefits, for example, CPP, EI, or WCP, and exclude discretionary benefits, such as bonuses and RSPs. If you have any senior management working whose costs are included in the labor and salaries, we need to ensure that there is proper support, record keeping, timesheets, and payroll records. And you have to identify if there are any workers working in foreign countries. And if they are, we go back to our foreign expenditure policy, and these need to be pre-approved as per the guidelines we've just discussed. Below, we have links to the eligibility guidelines and the consolidated OSC overview for your reference. Next slide, please. Slide. Once the project is approved and moves to the contracting stage, the OSC will work with the participants to better understand the project financial due diligence. We will work with you to help you better understand how is the project financed. Are there financing agreements in place to support the participants' contribution to the project? How is the project being supported from a day-to-day cash flow perspective? OSC Finance will work with you to understand the financial controls that are in place that could impact the project. For example, are PO approvals required? What's the approval limits, your thresholds, the responsibilities of the approver? Are there controls in place around cash disbursements and project expenses? We'll also look at the supporting documentation required. For example, when we're in the contract stage, we would ask the lead participant and all other major contributors for audited or reviewed financial statements. So these are some of the documents we'd require. Next slide, please. I guess the message here is we are here to help you. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. If you would like a preliminary review of your budget, please pass it in, and by March 31st, we'll have a look at your budget and answer any questions you have. As noted here, OSC budgets will take time to develop, and it's important to reach out to ensure that important details are not missed. Okay, next slide. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Okay, I think that's it in terms of the deck material. Let's see what we got here. Nothing new on terms of Q&A. We'll give it a few extra seconds or another minute or two. I realize that was a lot of information. So hopefully it will, answer some of the top of mind questions that you might have as you're kind of embarking on your full proposal process. We'll be meeting with, I think, all of you next week on the specifics of your proposal. Feel free to take all in that's what's been said today and follow up with additional questions on a project specific basis next week. We're around to help, and please submit by email. That obviously makes questions easier to track. But we'll certainly be available next week. And I guess just to reiterate what Kim said on particularly on budgets, like what we do find is people kind of wait till the last minute to do the budget, understandably, I guess, to a certain extent. But if you want to get a review and make sure that your ask includes all the possible eligible costs and excludes ineligible costs, for example, and you've really got your ask dialed in. And I guess just by the way, it's okay if your ask changes between the EOI and full proposal stage. So if that goes up, because you've got additional contributions coming in, or something about your project has changed, it's appropriate to modify your budget. That typically happens, actually. But obviously we wouldn't want a situation where the project has changed so much and the budget changes so much that it's kind of compromising and eroding the original kind of integrity of the EOI and what was put forward in terms of a project idea. So we obviously wouldn't want a project, budget to double because of a huge increase in scope that really wasn't part of your original proposed project outcomes, right? For example, but outside of that, we certainly expect fluctuations in budget and who's in and who's out and all that sort of thing. So that's just part of developing a full proposal. Let's see here, any others? Okay, so there's a question here just on looks like stacking. I don't know, Megan, if you wanted to. So what happens when the provincial government assists in supporting the public entity? How is that integrated into the OSCR? I mean, I think generally we would encourage people to list other public sources of funding, which it seems to be what is being proposed here. And you would include them in your project budget. You would include them in two places. You would include them in the project proposal template to make sure that that's clear at the top table there where everybody gets listed, no matter what kind of role they are. And then you can also include them in the project budget as a additional source of public dollars contributing to the total project value. So they would ideally get listed in the project budget as an additional source of public sector funding. What about participation by federal government agencies? Yeah, we can give lots of, so we generally have a pretty prolific amount of federal and provincial and different types of sources from the public sector, you know, being part of an OSC project budget. And so, you know, for example, we've had projects with AFF or ACOA or NRC IRAP or MyTax, really, just to name, and some of them are not kind of direct government, but just to name, I guess, a couple of kind of more of the more obvious and more dominating programs that typically show up on some of our budgets. So that those would be examples of departments. Oh, okay, you're talking about departments and agencies. Yeah, so I mean, we've had Environment Canada, DFO, for example. We've had provincial resource departments, you know, be part of projects. So generally speaking, it can be, you know, any federal government department that's contributing to the project and is a stakeholder and is part of the project plan. Canadian Coast Guard, for example, has been on our projects before. So, I mean, just to give you some idea that there's quite a few different types of federal and provincial departments that have participated in projects, and again, you would list them, particularly if they are contributing funding to the project in your project budget. And you know, in some cases, they could be less of a funding source and possibly more of a customer or an end user, possibly a validator of your technology. And so, in that particular case, you know, they would be a pretty significant public sector partner, and you would definitely want to elaborate on the nature of their interest and their involvement in the project in the actual proposal itself, and have that be part of the merits of your project and why it's a good fit for OSCR. Yeah, there's another couple of follow-up questions on this. I think I think I'd recommend if you've got kind of follow-up questions, we could definitely talk with you about it at a project level when we meet with you next week, for sure. Because quite often there's some devil in some of those details, particularly if there's stacking and people want to know more about, you know, how to include those amounts. Okay, I think that's all the Q&A I think that we've got coming in. So hopefully this was helpful for you, and you're getting an extra 45 minutes back in your day. So hopefully that's helpful as well. Definitely will be, I'm sure, to some of you on a Friday, in some cases Friday afternoon. So again, we'll likely chat to many of you next week, and please reach out in the interim if you've got any other questions, and hopefully have a good rest of your day and a good weekend. Thanks, everybody.